Last week we talked about the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. This week we'll talk about potential injuries and caring for the central nervous system, and we will also talk about special senses. Special senses primarily being eyesight and hearing. So with various problems with the central nervous system, one problem that can occur is what's known as sensory neural deafness. And this is a loss of hearing that's due to damage to the nervous portion of the ear. And I will talk about this some more when we talk specifically about the ear. This can be related to exposure to sound, and that's why it's in this category of caring for the central nervous system. When you're exposed to loud sounds over an extended period of time, it can lead to damage to the nervous structures. Measurement of loudness of sound is done by a measure called decibels, and if you've watched things on television, sporting events, various other events, they sometimes will talk about, how many decibels this crowd is making in the during their cheering and so forth. Rest and sleep is another opportunity to improve your health. It's very, very important to get adequate sleep. Dream sleep is the most important aspect of sleep. Dreams have a very positive impact on the central nervous system and central nervous system health. This is known as REM sleep. REM stands for rapid eye movement, and during REM sleep is when most of the important dreaming occurs. Probably the most significant toxin that can have an impact on the central nervous system is alcohol. Alcohol is the most common drug of abuse in the United States, far more common than marijuana or narcotics. It is a depressant of the central nervous system. It slows the neural conduction and slows the functioning of the nerves. The breakdown product of alcohol is something called acetaldehyde. Acetaldehyde is actually a toxin, and this toxin is usually responsible for the symptoms associated with what we call a hangover, which is headache and sickness to your stomach. Another thing that can occur with alcohol is something called a neuritis. Remember, the term itis means inflammation, and so neuritis is inflammation of the nerves that actually can cause damage to the nerves and can cause a degeneration of the nerves. It's important to note that when a nerve cell dies, it cannot be regenerated, and the existing nerve cells cannot reproduce, and so they must group together to try to make up for the lost nerve cells' function. Whiplash is an injury that can occur in the central nervous system, in the spinal cord, that injures the spinal nerves in the neck. And this is something that occurs particularly in car accidents where the head violently moves forward, or usually violently moves back first, then violently moves forward, and that motion back and forth causes damage to the spinal nerve. Sciatica is a specific problem that you probably have heard your family talk about from time to time. This is a compromise of the sciatic nerve. The sciatic nerve leads from the spinal cord in the lumbar region down through the leg to the foot. And when the sciatic nerve is pinched or injured, it causes pain and loss of function in the leg. A stroke, which is probably the most common injury to the central nervous system, is caused by a compromise of blood to the brain. Now, there are actually three individual forms of stroke: an intracerebral bleed, intra meaning within, so a bleed that occurs within the brain, or brain substance; a subarachnoid hemorrhage, which is a bleed that occurs in the subarachnoid space around the brain; and then ischemia, or loss of blood flow to the brain that causes brain cells to die. A concussion is essentially a bruise that occurs to the brain. When somebody is struck forcefully on the head, the brain will move inside the skull in such a way as to bang up against the side of the skull, and this can cause a bruise, which is called a concussion. If it's severe enough, there can be loss of consciousness and significant injury. This can lead to a loss of memory, which is known as amnesia, And then we spoke about this term before, but the more severe situation is when a coma occurs, which is a loss of consciousness that occurs over an extended period of time. Now, there are some diseases of the nervous system that we'll talk about with this slide. One is one that we've talked about before called tetanus. Tetanus is a disease that's caused by the toxin from the organism Clostridium tetani. And tetanus causes a paralysis and loss of nerve function within both peripherally and in the central nervous system. But it can lead to spasming and cause something known as lockjaw, which is a spasm of the masseter muscles. Delirium is, there are two terms, I'll show both of them here. There's dementia and delirium, and essentially they're the same thing. Dementia is a loss of memory and neural function that is chronic and occurs over a long period of time. Delirium is the same symptom complex of loss of memory and usually loss of function, but it only occurs a short period of time and is reversible. Usually dementia is not reversible. Delirium, on the other hand, is reversible. And then there's one specific type of dementia known as Alzheimer's disease. It's singled out primarily because there's no known cause, and it's fairly common and causes severe debility and death. The last thing I'll mention is something called epilepsy, which you've probably heard of. Epilepsy is a malfunction of the neurons that results in rapid, massive firing of neurons. And this rapid, massive firing is known as a seizure. The most typical seizure is called a tonic-clonic seizure. What that means is initially there's a period of tonicity, which is the body will completely become board-like and rigid for a period of time. That's called tonus. And then after that occurs, then you have clonic or jerking motions that occurs after the tonic portion. Now we're going to talk about sensory receptors. Sensory receptors are specialized structures that relay information from the environment to the brain. The somatic senses are the senses that detect temperature and pressure. The special senses are senses such as sight and hearing that relay special information to the brain. The 5 special senses are sight, hearing, smell, taste, and balance. The sensations of the skin are pain, which is relayed by bare dendritic structures that react to strong stimuli in the skin. Mechanoreceptors are receptors that react to touch and pressure in the skin. There's something known as muscle sense, which is, I believe I've mentioned this before, but it's where the body actually knows in space where your limbs are and where your muscles are and how tense they are and how much tension that they're generating. And then in the skin there's also thermal receptors which note changes in temperature. They note heat as well as cold. The chemical senses are the senses of taste and smell. They're called chemical senses because they sense the chemicals either on the tongue or in the nose react with nerves that sense the various tastes that we experience or the various smells we experience. But it's specifically a chemical stimulation. So these chemoreceptors detect specific chemicals that are relayed through the central nervous system and interpreted as certain tastes or smells. In the tongue, there are the taste buds, which have the taste receptors and experience the chemical changes that lead to specific interpretations. These taste cells are within something known as papillae in the tongue. The papillae are projections from the tongue that contain the taste buds and experience the taste receptor or the taste changes. There's what's known as the nasal cavity. The nasal cavity is the location of olfactory receptors. The olfactory nerve, which is the first cranial nerve, carries the sensations of smell to the brain. Now it's interesting that taste and smell are related to each other in such a way that if you cannot smell your food, the taste experience is significantly hampered when your olfactory nerve is not working properly. And if you can do an experiment where you wear nose plugs so you can't smell what you're eating, and you'll find that your ability to taste goes down significantly. There are 7 fundamental primary odors that a mixture of which causes the various smells that we experience. Now let's turn specifically to the organs of sense organs, and the first one is the ear. The outer ear is right here and is the area of the ear starting with what we can see on the outside. It includes the ear canal and then stops at the eardrum. And the outer ear is this visible part is called the auricle, and it's designed to capture sound waves and funnel them into the ear canal. And then the ear canal is the passage that leads from the outside through the skull. And if you have a skull, you'll notice there's a hole right here where the ear canal penetrates and leads up to the eardrum. And the eardrum is a tight membrane at the end of the ear canal that when the sound waves moves into the ear canal, it causes a vibration of this membrane. And this marks the end of the outer ear. And then we talk about the middle ear, and this is the middle ear right here. It's this area from the tympanic membrane to the area where this bone stimulates the cochlea. And the 3 bones, we've talked about these 3 bones when we were talking about bones, but the 3 bones are the malleolus, or the hammer, the incus, or the anvil, and the stapes, or the stirrup. And when this vibration hits the eardrum, it causes a vibration first of the malleolus, which then hits the incus, and lastly pulls on the stapes, and then that sets up a vibration that is transmitted into the cochlea. And the cochlea is the significant organ of the middle ear, and it is this area that looks like a seashell. Also in the middle ear is the auditory nerve, which comes off the cochlea, and then also it's the semicircular canals and the vestibular nerve, which is responsible for balance. Now, sound does not have to necessarily go through the outer ear, middle ear, and the cochlea. It can actually be transmitted through the bones. And you can take a tuning fork, for example, and just put it up against your mastoid process on your skull, and you can hear the tone even if you can't hear it through the air. Now, the ears can be damaged or injured in some way. Probably one of the more common problems is a puncture of the eardrum, which generally occurs when you stick something in your ear that's sharp that you shouldn't be putting in your ear. Fortunately, most of these will heal, but you can permanently damage your eardrum and lose hearing by causing repeated punctures of the eardrum. And this can lead to a problem known as tinnitus. Tinnitus is the doctor word or the technical word for a ringing sensation in the ears. You can also have ear infections. Children have a lot of problems with ear infections. As you get older, ear infections become less common. And there's a passage, let me see if I can show that to you. We'll go back. There's this passage that goes from the middle ear down to the throat, and that passage is called the eustachian tube. And the purpose of this passage is to equalize pressure between the ear here and the throat so that you don't have a problem with a pressure buildup inside the ear. And you will experience this if it happens when your ears quote unquote pop. And that also occurs when you have a cold or something and this tube becomes blocked. Now let's go back here. So the eustachian tube, that passage, in children, that passage is shorter and straighter such that it's more common to transport bacteria up into the middle ear. The other specialized organ is called the eye, And the eye is shown, the external aspect of the eye is shown here. It's inside a bony protection called the socket, which rims the outside of the eye and protects the eye. That bony socket is called an orbit. And then there's also the eyelid. The purpose of the eyelid is twofold. One is to protect the eye from particles, but also it helps lubricate or keep the eye moist. Above the eye here are lacrimal glands, and the lacrimal glands produce tears. The tears are produced in the upper outer aspect of the eye. They flow across the eye, and then they're drained here in the lower part by the lacrimal duct into the lacrimal sac and ultimately into the nose. This is why when a person cries, their nose becomes stopped up. It's because the tears are drained into the nose and it becomes full of water, and that's why people, when they cry, they have to blow their nose. Inside these tears is something called a lysozyme. Lysozyme is a chemical that kills bacteria. The extrinsic muscles, by that we're talking about the muscles that control the eyelids so that you can close your eyelids very tightly and protect it from outside problems. Inside the eye, you have a tough outer layer, which is this white layer called the sclera, and that's this layer of the eye right here. Then, across where the sclera meets the front of the eye, there's a clear membrane or a clear covering called the cornea. The cornea is clear or transparent to allow light to enter the eye. In the back is where the optic nerve is. The sclera here, and this is the optic nerve leading outside the eye, and then these are the blood vessels going into the eye. The middle layer, you see there's 3 layers here. This middle layer is called the uvea. It leads right around, and it actually becomes contiguous with the iris. And that's called the choroid. And the choroid is a connective tissue layer that brings in blood vessels and nutrition to the eye. The ciliary body is here and here, and it attaches to the lens, and it is what these muscles pull the lens in order to focus the eye on an object near or far. And then, as I said, the choroid is contiguous with the iris. The iris is in this area, and it basically controls the amount of light that enters the eye. And this hole is what we call a pupil, and that's where light enters the eye and the eye comes in. Now, I will talk about the fovea. The fovea is right here. It's this area of depression, and the fovea is the center of vision. It's got the most rods and cones, primarily cones, and it's where the best vision occurs. And so the retina extends all the way from around, and this is the fovea part. And the only place that there isn't a fovea or isn't retina is right here at the optic nerve. There are no rods and cones at the optic nerve, and you can see that if an image were to hit that, you wouldn't be able to see it. And that's what we're going to talk about when we talk about a blind spot. So the rods are light sensitive, but they only see black and white. Whereas the cones, and here's a rod here, and this is a cone. The cones are the ones that see color, and this is just a schematic of the retina showing the rods and cones here, and the nerve cells that are attached to the rods and cones, and these go to the optic nerve. And as I said in the previous slide, the center of vision is called the fovea, and it's the center of vision in the retina. And so that's the area of the eye that it's very important not to have damage. And then I mentioned in the previous slide the blind spot. This is where the optic nerve enters the eye, and there's no rods or cones in that area. Now, when the optic nerve leaves the eye, they both travel along the optic nerve course, but in the brain they reach a point where they cross. And the place where the optic nerves cross is called the optic chiasm. And the neural path to the brain is called the optic tracts. And you'll remember that I said that the visual sensations ultimately end up in the optic lobe, occipital lobe, excuse me. The substance in the rods that absorb light is called rhodopsin. Rhodopsin is a light-sensitive chemical that produces an electric impulse when exposed to light. And so the rod cells allow us to see light in shades of gray, black and white shades of gray, but they do not see color. Color is seen by the cone part of our eye. And so this diagram shows the various wavelengths, and there are actually, as you can see, different cones for different colors. The red cones see the red area wavelength. The green cones see an area that's more green, and then up in this area, the blue cones occur in this area. Now there's a phenomenon known as persistence of vision. Persistence of vision is a brief time after the image is removed that the sense of the image is still seen by the retina. So for example, if you take an object and you stare at it for a particular period of time and then you remove it, you can see a shadow of it after you've removed the object, and that's called persistence of vision. Now the fluid between the iris and the cornea in this area right here is called the aqueous humor, and then it goes back to the lens, which focuses the vision on the back of the eye, and the process of focusing is called accommodation. This is the process of changing the curvature of the lens to focus the image on the back of the eye. So when you look at an object, this object's near, you can see that the lens thickens to focus the object on the back of the eye. And so the ciliary muscles cause the lens to bulge and make the image focus where it needs to focus. The fluid between the lens and the retina is called the vitreous or vitreous humor. And so the vitreous humor can detach and cause problems by detaching. That commonly occurs in older people. Now, the last few minutes, let's talk about defective vision. Nearsightedness, which is very common, is when the distance from the lens to the retina is too far. So the result is that the image, rather than being focused on the retina, is focused in front of the retina, and the retina cannot see it well. This is called myopia. And farsightedness is the opposite. It's when the distance from the retina to the lens is too short and the image is actually focused beyond the retina. And this is called hyperopia. And this just shows what happens if your distance here from here to here is too far, it's focused in front of the retina, and so the image appears blurred in this way. And you put a concave lens in front of the eye and it will correct that problem. Conversely, in farsightedness, the image, you notice this eyeball is quite a bit shorter. The image is focused behind, and so the person can't really see it very well. You use the convex lens to focus it on the back of the eye. And astigmatism is an irregular curvature of the cornea, which results in a distortion of the image. And then presbyopia is just farsightedness that occurs with age. And everybody, because of the lens, slowly breaks down over time. Everybody, if they live to be old enough, will have presbyopia. Another thing that will eventually occur in everybody, if they live long enough, are cataracts, which is a clouding of the lens. Color blindness is a problem with the ability to distinguish one or more of the primary colors being red, yellow, and blue. And night blindness is a problem with rods that causes an inability to see in low light situations. Glaucoma is an increase in intraorbital pressure that can, if the pressure gets high enough, the retina can be compromised and the person can become blind.